What was the state of readiness of the Army in the interwar years between World War I and World War II? How did the Army mobilize and transform tactics and equipment to meet the new challenges? How was the Army affected in the attacks on Pearl Harbor? And how did they respond in Hawaii and throughout Asia? For answers to these questions and more Army History Insights, stay tuned.
Welcome to the U.S. Army History and Heritage Podcast, the official podcast of the United States Army Center of Military History. The Center of Military History writes and publishes the Army's official history, manages the U.S. Army Museum Enterprise, and provides historical support throughout the U.S. Army.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to the United States Army History and Heritage Podcast. I'm Lee Reynolds, the Strategic Communications Officer for the Center of Military History. In this episode, we're looking at the events that led to World War II and the state of readiness and training for the U.S. Army during those interwar years through the attack on Pearl Harbor. Joining me for this discussion is Dr. Dave Hogan. Thank you, Dave, for being here.
Well, thanks for having me. Always a pleasure.
And so just a little bit about Dr. Hogan. He is a native of Michigan, and he received his bachelor's degree from Dartmouth College in 1980 and his PhD from Duke University in 1986. After teaching at Elon College, he joined the U.S. Army Center of Military History in 1987. It's a long time ago. He's been here quite a while.
Reagan administration.
Now, he is the author of several books. First, author of Command Post at War, the first Army headquarters in Europe from 1943 to 45. He wrote Raiders or Elite Infantry, the changing role of the U.S. Army Rangers from Dieppe to Grenada. That sounds fascinating.
That was my dissertation.
Oh, wow. He also wrote the book U.S. Army Special Operations in World War II. And finally, Centuries of Service, the U.S. Army from 1775 to 2005. And for 15 years, he taught an honors seminar at the University of Maryland, College Park, on American attitudes towards warfare and the military. And he's also taught in the Norwich University's online military history program. He's a former trustee of the Society for Military History and is currently working on a biography of General of the Army Omar Bradley. So, Dave, that's a lot of World War II history there and some other things, but I think as a subject matter expert on this topic, you're just the right guy.
I look forward to speaking about it.
All right. So there's so much information to talk about. So it's how are we going to narrow it down to some of the key points. But let's just get into the discussion. So you've got, after World War I, those interwar years. Just set up for us, how is the Army transforming? What lessons did it learn from World War I? And how was it organized? And what was the state of equipment and tactics for the Army?
Well, one of the most amazing things in American military history, Lee, is how the weak, outmoded American Army of the interwar years became the powerful conquering force that won World War II, along with the other services and allies, of course. But it's really quite impressive because practically up to the eve of the war, this was not much of an army in terms of readiness. And part of that was, in the interwar years, the United States faced probably about as minimal a threat as it's ever faced in its history. The Indian Wars were over. There was the remote possibility of war with Japan, although that had receded somewhat after the Washington Conference of 1921. And there was possible trouble on the border with Mexico, which was still recovering from its revolution. But there was a general attitude in the country, we're not going to intervene in Europe again. That wasn't such a great idea. And the focus was on defending the homeland, on presumed operations on the North American continent, and perhaps on the colonies. There of course, was War Plan Orange, and the event that we got in a war with Japan, the Army would fight in the Philippines, hold out in the Philippines, hunker down while the Navy advanced west across the Pacific to relieve it. And that was the plan. The Philippines, Teddy Roosevelt used to refer to the Philippines as the Achilles heel of American strategy. And as we get into this series, we'll find out precisely why.
But when you mentioned that Plan Orange, when was that created?
Had its roots a little bit before, but World War I, but it's really developed during the interwar years.
Okay. Yeah. So they saw the rising threat from Japan.
Yeah, it's pretty well. It was perhaps the biggest plan we had in our earliest. Well, obviously because we had other color plans. We had Plan Red in case we went to war with Britain, and Plan Green in case we went to war with Mexico. Okay. But there were all these color plans that the Army strategists were developing. You talked about the lessons of World War I, and the biggest lessons that the Army drew focused on mobilization and adjusting to this industrial warfare of mass armies. The World War I mobilization had been very fragmented, very ad hoc, had not gone very well. Indeed, we had ended up using a lot of Allied planes and artillery and equipment because we were so unable to manufacture them on our own. The National Defense Act of 1920, or I should say, somebody's out there is going to say it's really the amendment to the National Defense Act of 1916, tried to create a structure for mobilization in the future, establishing 9 geographic areas in the continental United States, each with 6 divisions. And those 6 divisions in each corps area would come from the 3 components of the Army at that point. You have the regular Army, there would be 1 division from the regular Army, 2 National Guard divisions, and 3 from the reserve components. Okay. And it set the regular Army at 17,700 officers and about 280,000 men as the maximum level. Wow. It charged the War Department with mobilization planning and preparation, which was assigned to the Assistant Secretary of War. And indeed, during the rest of the 20s and 30s, the War Department is developing these mobilization plans. It's one of the big things they're doing. But the actual size of the Army comes out to much less. We settle, I think, around 17th among the world armies.
And at that time, we weren't in a draft, right? This was still just all volunteer after World War I?
Yes, okay. This was an all-volunteer Army, scattered in garrisons at posts across the continental United States. We did have some troops in Hawaii, the Hawaii Division, some troops in the Philippines as an American possession, and in the wake of the Boxer Rebellion of the early 20th century, we had a garrison at Tientsin, China.
Still at this point in the 20s or 30s? Mm-hmm. Okay.
But these guys are really scattered. And when they were that scattered, they could only train in battalions and companies, doing things like small unit tactics and marching PT. Marksmanship is still kind of a bit of a fetish in the interwar Army. It's still very, very highly regarded. And but there's not a lot of money. In the National Defense Act, it called for this force structure, but the Army's only getting $300 million per year, which is about half the cost of what the MDA force structure is going to be. So enlisted men had very low pay, lived in rotting barracks, eating war surplus food and using war surplus clothing. Not surprisingly, there were high desertion rates, gambling and prostitution, and even drinking, despite prohibition during that period. The Army does develop some equipment, the 105 millimeter howitzer. We get the Garand rifle in the 1930s, development and motorization. But there's not a lot of new equipment because so much of it is obsolete, and the War Department says, you have all this leftover equipment from World War I. So we're relying on World War I stocks. And when it comes time to modernize, we cut modernization programs to protect personnel, preserve personnel, especially officers. It's a pretty officer-heavy Army at this stage. And the War Department takes funds from R&D, from research and development, to postpone the purchase of new weapons and equipment. And when they do start to get new weapons, they standardize weapons designs to facilitate the procurement. So they have a standard weapon, and they set these are the designs, which hampers development of new technology. There's a lack of essential motor transport, not enough modern tanks for a battalion. Infantry is still the primary branch. the Army's thinking, although the Army is thinking, even with the experience of World War I, it's not thinking so much in terms of trench warfare, but big unit maneuver warfare across North America.
Oh, wow.
Using a combination of infantry, horse cavalry, and artillery. Horse cavalry is still a big deal.
And through when? When was the horse cavalry kind of like?
Well, right on into 1939, 1940.
Wow.
Yeah, it shows amazing persistence.
Mm-hmm.
And there is an emphasis on combined arms: the rifle, the machine gun, the mortar, the tank, and especially artillery. The Army is very good during this period at developing the infantry-artillery coordination, which, of course, will assist it enormously in World War II. And the basic tactics: under cover of the fire base, you advance in dispersed, inconspicuous groups using the terrain. The Army conducted a lot of map exercises. It couldn't conduct actual maneuvers of large size units, but it did conduct map exercises using American terrain, particularly the Susquehanna Valley and the Missouri Valley seem to be very popular. Where you'd have these movements using open flanks, horse cavalry scouting, and screening, applying the principles of war. The principles of war is really big in this period. Concentration, offensive, surprise, security, all those things. And a lot of emphasis on seizing the initiative, conducting main and secondary attacks, and envelopments. When you're talking about North America, you've got this spread out territory. You have open flanks that you can move around and conduct envelopments. And when you don't have open flanks, you conduct frontal attacks in depth to achieve a penetration. Still, even with this, what they called open warfare, it's still very, in that sense, it's more mobile than the trench warfare of World War I, but it's still, in a lot of ways, very stuck in earlier periods. Map exercises in the Susquehanna Valley often drew on the Gettysburg campaign.
Oh, wow. Okay.
So there's a lot of emphasis on reserves and on the schools, the organized reserves, and professional military education. The staff schools, though, their purpose really is not to turn out military geniuses as generals, but to develop a lot of very logical, balanced, clear-thinking staff officers. Their schools are often criticized for stifling creativity with what became known as the school solutions. There is an overstrength officer corps that spent, a lot of those extra officers spend a lot of time in schools. Teaching ROTC is a key function during this time, working with the National Guard. And there really is, when you look at the curriculum, minimal emphasis on tanks and planes, even though both had been introduced in World War I. It's generally the culture of the Army of the interwar years is very conservative. A lot of emphasis on the traditional values and the prejudices of the time. It reflected the prejudices of society, maybe even to a greater degree. A lot of Darwinian racial attitudes and a fear that the good WASP stock was getting undermined by immigration and racial mixing. It was a very racially aware period. Also,
we still had desegregation in the military, and there were no women in the military at that point.
Yeah, right. Well, there were Army Nurse Corps. But and then there was a closer kinship with corporate America than there had been in past years because of World War I had taught the need for the Army to work together with industry for mobilization.
The beginning of what Eisenhower would call the industrial military complex.
Yes. Yeah, there's a lot of that shared views. The Army's getting to appreciate the expertise of corporate America in managing large organizations. So previously, before World War I think the Army largely saw themselves as noble and noble servants of the country, and capitalists were money grubbers. But that's changing. You have carefully manicured, orderly communities. To enlisted men, the Army was kind of a combination of a school, an athletic club, an orphan's home, and a boys' camp all rolled together. Athletics was a big deal. Troops took a lot of pride in their uniform and in their unit for sports. For officers, it was a men's club. It was small enough to know others, especially within your service branch. People called it a rich man's life on a small income, sometimes in exotic locations like Hawaii or the Philippines, and a broad array of social functions, dances, balls, house calls, dinners, parties, bridge. They ape the wealthier elites with polo and horseback riding. Wow. It's a very horsey army. Yeah. Even the infantry gets into this cult of the horses. One publication described an army officer of the 20s and 30s as a queer mix of a clergyman, a college professor, and a small boy playing Indian.
Oh, wow.
But pay and promotions were stagnant, and many officers resigned to look for better opportunities in the private sector. The others plodded on, saying, "Oh, we're doing this for the service of the country somehow." Mm-hmm. There is a cultural emphasis on loyalty with a lot of single-issue constituencies, and we mentioned the cult of the horse. Mm-hmm. Horse cavalry hindered innovation. Right well into the 1930s, you have the power of branch chiefs like the chief of cavalry, who saw mechanization as a threat. Sure. They actually come up with this scheme of, okay, we'll use trucks and trailers to haul the horses around to where we want them, and then we'll use the horses.
Oh, wow.
So in 1939, you have an army that's just 190,000 men, wow. 4 understrength square divisions, the old square division of World War I, 1 small cavalry division spread out across 130 posts in the continental United States. There's also a half-strength division in Hawaii and a Philippine division of 3,500 men. So this is an army that's, in 1939, is not really ready for anything. Right. Went beyond. It's just kind of a model for expansion.
Mm-hmm. So and then by 1939, we already saw Japanese aggression going on in China and throughout some areas of the Pacific. You had the threats, the looming war in Europe that people could see coming. So based on those world events, how did Army leadership start to change and better prepare for what many thought was getting involved in the war?
One thing, when I talk about technology in the Army adapting, I should mention, for one thing, one area that American culture was interested in was aviation. The Army viewed the plane as a vehicle for reconnaissance and fire support, starting in the 1920s. That's been its role during World War I. And Billy Mitchell conducted those bomb tests in 1921 and 1923. Mitchell was probably the most outspoken certainly the most outspoken, maybe the most prominent American air officer of that generation. And he conducted bomb tests on obsolete naval vessels, some German battleships left over from World War I, to demonstrate the effectiveness of airplanes for continental protection. We no longer just need the Navy. In fact, the Air Force could be better. And he was very outspoken about the possibilities of aviation, to the point that he got court-martialed for insubordination in 1926. But at that time, you have to recall that the aircraft were still not that advanced. And by and large, the Army still viewed it as, like I said, a reconnaissance device, combat against hostile aircraft, maybe a little bit of bombing here and there. The National Defense Act did create the Air Service, and in 1926 that later became an equal combat arm, the Army Air Corps. Increasingly focuses on strategic bombing as a principal mission, and indeed becomes a parochial interest of the Air Corps. The Air Force really starts to develop this notion of using unescorted, high-altitude bombers able to defend themselves on daylight precision strikes against industries.
So this was developed even before the war?
The concept.
Yeah.
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah.
Wow.
Through the 1930s, heavy bomber formations that could defend themselves on long-range missions to the target. And the B-17 comes out during this period, and that seems to offer the right technology. They call it the Flying Fortress for a reason. It's got all these weapons poking out of it,
machine guns,
and capacity to drop bombs. But the Air Force doesn't give a lot of attention to close air support, which meant that air-ground coordination would have to develop during the war.
All right, so this brings us really up to September 1939. So we have war breaking out in Europe. As I mentioned, we've already got conflict going on in Asia. So with all this happening, what was the Army doing?
It's a tough period for the Army because part of it was the Great Depression, which made Americans very inward. They were more isolationist than ever.
Right.
And there was a lot of suspicion that the British had dragged us into World War I with their propaganda, and suspicion that the munitions makers had helped them so they could make more money from the war. And this is probably a period of greater anti-militarism in the United States than had often been the past, to the point that officers in Washington wore civilian clothing in public.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, you see pictures of George Marshall during this period. He's walking around in mufti.
So it was a challenge, right? The whole isolationist movement was a challenge to overcome. But people like Marshall, they knew we've got to do something.
Yes, yeah. Well, he gets involved, but there is some development in the late 30s. The Army starts getting some more money, mostly for the Air Corps and for coastal defenses, and it uses it to. It's able to bring up enlisted man levels to greater strength and raise some pay, do some things, some larger field maneuvers. You've got the Protective Mobilization Plan, which calls for the induction of 400,000 National Guard to protect the country while we mobilize a full army. So they're playing around with this in the late 30s, but of course the urgency increases in September 39 when President Roosevelt declares a limited national emergency, and the Army starts to take some small steps. The Army wants to raise itself to its full 280,000 man level. FDR only raises it to 227,000 and raises the National Guard to 235,000. He permits more reserve officers to go on active duty. There's some funds to expand motorization. The Army could now gather enough troops to create a real field Army headquarters. You'd only had the core areas before, and headquarters staffs were mere skeletons. In the spring of 1940, you have the first genuine Corps and Army maneuvers in American military history. They start revising the field manuals, but still, Lee, there's just a lot of complacency. Yeah, I mean, there's still even the Army figures and says that the Western Hemisphere is not under threat.
Okay, right.
But there's no intrinsic reason. There are strong countries opposing the fascist countries in both those areas, and it's not necessarily followed that we will have to get involved. And there's a lot of faith among the populace in general, as there's been throughout American history, in the invincible citizen in arms presumably taking his rifle from his fire hearth and jumping into the and in American industrial capacity to overwhelm. Isolationists, communists, Roosevelt haters thought Roosevelt was going to find a way of dragging the United States into the war, so they're suspicious of that.
How did that affect the 1940 presidential election?
Well, it's certainly there, although it's more muted because Wilkie actually supports a lot of Roosevelt's steps, Wendell Wilkie. There's isolationist sentiment, but it's more muted.
And what about the draft? When was that brought back?
Well, we get into that with the fall. Initially, Franklin Roosevelt, his main response was getting more aircraft, more ships for the Navy. And Marshall was very cautious within the limits set by the White House. And part of it because of the Army's own outlook. The Army is still thinking in more limited terms, not in terms of a global war.
Defending the homeland.
Yeah, but Marshall does warn, if Europe blazes, the U.S. must put its house in order before sparks reach the Western Hemisphere. Yeah, and then in the spring of 1940, Europe blazed. We were unprepared. Suddenly, it was like, this is where the change really comes, May, June 1940. we are unprepared. The French army, which had so much respect, collapsed before the German blitzkrieg, the planes and tanks of lightning war. And the assumptions that had guided American policy for 150 years, that we had these two oceans that protected us, we don't have to worry about the Eastern Hemisphere, came into question. The fall of France, now theoretically the Germans could invade into French Northwest Africa, and they'd only be about 1,600 miles from Brazil.
Oh, wow.
All these new theories that, the long-range bombers can now reach the United States from bases. And it starts to change our whole thinking about security.
Yeah.
That we no longer can hide behind the British Navy and the two oceans. And this leads to the greatest peacetime mobilization in U.S. history. FDR calls for $1 billion more in defense spending, 50,000 planes per year, a two-ocean Navy. That just hits everybody. And the Army receives $8 billion between 1940 and 1941. Roosevelt brings in a new Secretary of War, the 72-year-old Republican Henry Stimson, former Secretary of State and Secretary of War, well known for his prestige and his integrity. In July 1940, the War Department activated General Headquarters to supervise organization and training. This is the precursor of the organization that's going to build up and train the Army during World War II, and the rise of Lieutenant General Leslie J. McNair. Of course, the post that we are at is named after him.
We're recording here at Center of Military History at Fort McNair in D.C.
August 1940, Congress approves the call-up of 18 National Guard divisions, although it limits their use to the Western Hemisphere. In September 1940, and this wasn't even something the administration and the Army were pushing, but a new preparedness movement says, we've got to get a Selective Service Act going, and they push that through Congress. Wow. And all males 21 to 35 have to register. The Army dusts off its industrial mobilization plans for the 30s, expands the capacity for military production by immediate orders and the creation of new industrial facilities. It starts a crash program to construct training camps, even though there's shortages of lumber and clothing. Trouble is, as we get into it, 1941, and mobilization is growing, but we're getting deeper into it. A lot of the Army's needs conflict with the imperative that the Roosevelt administration feels for aid to Britain.
Okay.
And later aid to the Soviet Union after Hitler invades the Soviet Union in June of 41. The Army's like, we need this equipment for ourselves. And under pressure, Marshall declares several weapon stocks obsolete so that they could then be sold to a middleman who would sell them to the British. Roosevelt decreed that the United States share half of its bomber production with the British, even though that would impact pilot training. Meanwhile, the Victory Program establishes that we need 8 million men in 215 divisions, estimates we're going to need that to defeat the Axis. Wow. At that time, they were assuming that Russia would not survive. We were rushing a program in schools to get more officers into the field, developing the Officers Candidate School that turned out hundreds of officer candidates like an assembly line, the 90-day wonders they were called. And in the summer and fall of 1941, we had our first large maneuvers, Army-level maneuvers in Louisiana and the Carolinas. Yet still the great debate is intensifying. There's still most Americans, they don't want to get involved. Even as the United States expands its defense perimeter, conducts an undeclared naval war against the Germans. The conscription bill comes up for renewal in August of 41, and it only passes Congress by one vote.
Wow.
There's still a prohibition against sending selectees outside the Western Hemisphere. And the pace of rearmament and mobilization, if anything, toward the late 41 seems to be slowing. As there's this sense of, well, maybe if we get involved, we'll just need to use the Navy, the Air Force, and our industry and rely on other allies. And there's a lot of sentiment, still this hope that we could avoid an immediate shutdown. And then, of course, along came Pearl Harbor.
Well, now you said that the act prevented us from sending people outside the Western Hemisphere, but we had troops in the Philippines,
Yes.
right?
Yeah,
I think
those are regular troops.
I got you. Okay, so there was a distinction there between.
Yeah, although we do later start to send, I think they get a waiver of some kind, that they start to send some National Guard troops, some other troops there.
So just prior to Pearl Harbor, let's say by the end of November, how was the Army arrayed around the world?
Well, at the time, in 1941, by fall of 41, the Army had 27 infantry divisions, 5 armored divisions, 2 cavalry divisions. But only 4, but that was largely on paper, only 4 of those divisions and maybe an armored corps figured to be ready within 6 months. The vast majority of the Army was still in the continental United States. We had expanded our perimeter a little bit to protect the Western Hemisphere, some folks in the Caribbean, the Panama Canal, and of course the Philippines, which was an American possession, and Hawaii.
And then we had other islands out there. There was Wake. Were we in Guam then, or was that something we got after the war?
We had Guam, but it was
Guam.
only a token American force.
Okay.
Not much of an American force there. The Philippines and the Hawaii had the most troops.
And then I think Midway. So that was pretty much the extent of the U.S. forces, Army forces out there.
Yeah.
Okay. But nothing in Europe, right? We weren't.
No.
We had no presence there. Observers, perhaps. and
Yeah,
that's about
observers.
It.
Exactly.
So then, we get Pearl Harbor.
And I still think From Here to Eternity is a great war movie. It was written by a guy who served in the pre-Pearl Harbor Army, and I still like Tora Tora Tora, although not Pearl Harbor. Pearl Harbor was one hit my.
Tora 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 was a great film, and From Here to Eternity as well. I mean, that was really. I worked in those same barracks that they used at Schofield Barracks in there, and we know of the attack on Pearl Harbor. We know it was, an attack against naval installations, but it was more than that. How was the Army involved on that day?
Oh, yes. Well, the Army was very involved. The Army had an enormous presence in the Hawaiian Islands. We knew the war was coming. We didn't know where it was. We had broken the Japanese code. We knew the Japanese were going to attack. We just didn't know where. And generally, the assumptions were that it would be in the Philippines or Southeast Asia. That those were the main trouble spots. The idea that a Japanese fleet would come all the way across the Pacific and strike with naval air against Pearl Harbor just does not seem to have occurred. And we weren't ready. Marshall was out horseback riding on the morning of the attack, a leisurely Sunday. He had sent a warning to Pearl Harbor, but it went by commercial telegram and didn't arrive until after the attack had already started. The commander in Pearl Harbor, Lieutenant General Walter Short, was more concerned about saboteurs among the population, which was largely Japanese American. He was more concerned about saboteurs. And consequently, he parked his planes wingtip to wingtip at Wheeler and Hickam Fields.
And that was the Army Air Forces or the Air Corps at the time? Air Forces.
It's still the Army Air Corps at this point.
Okay.
Yeah. And the Army took heavy losses when the attack came. I mean, the main Japanese objective was the battleships, but they also went after Army barracks, supply depots, hangars, and the runways at Hickam and Wheeler, where all these planes were out there vulnerable, wingtip to wingtip. In all, they destroyed 164 planes and seriously damaged another 128. And the Army lost 700 people in this attack. Not quite like the loss of life on the Arizona, but still, the Army took some losses.
And then there was an immediate mobilization too. I mean, Hawaii had a plan to defend against invasion, and that's what the Army divisions that were there at the time.
Yeah.
They spread out.
Yeah, well, generally around the country, you had the reaction that the Army adapted plans to guard dams, factories, key points against saboteurs, and those plans went into effect. There had been some preparation in that regard, but still, next day, the United States declares war on Japan. Then Germany and Italy declared war on the United States, which is on December 11th, which was an interesting development since could Roosevelt have gotten a declaration of war against those other countries, even though we already were practically in a war in the North Atlantic.
Yeah, and then we just briefly talked about the Philippines, but of course General MacArthur was there.
Yes.
Yeah, at the time, so he was in command there.
Mm-hmm.
And then I don't want to go too far in past Pearl Harbor. We're going to save that for the next episode.
Mm-hmm.
But just briefly in the immediate aftermath of Pearl Harbor, the next 2-3 weeks, basically what happened.
Well, the Army just mobilized. I think went on alert, really.
Mm-hmm.
I think what you got is, like in the United States, Omar Bradley was at Fort Benning, Georgia. He was the commandant there. And he at the infantry school, and he sent troops to protect key facilities nearby in those areas.
Right.
And that's generally what the Army did. Of course, we were quickly at war in the Philippines, and then those troops came under attack fairly quickly. Although we'll cover most of that in the next episode.
Yeah, and it reminds me, of 9/11.
Mm-hmm. Oh yeah.
I was a reservist at the time, and I wasn't at home. I was in Atlanta, and it was the same thing. We're all calling in. Where do we go? Where do I report? What do we do? And
there were a lot of comparisons at that time, and I remember that time to Pearl Harbor and the impact of 9/11.
Yeah, not knowing what was next.
And just like that, isolationism went out. Neutrality went out of fat. Previously, when you had a lot of very prestigious Americans who opposed any aid to Britain, and who did not want the United States to get involved. A lot of people around the country. Of course, by this point, the communists wanted America to get involved because the Soviet Union had been attacked. Right. So,
I know we still had the draft, but there was a lot of volunteers in the aftermath of Pearl Harbor, just like we saw after 9/11.
Yeah, the rush. The rush to volunteer. That volunteer ethic. My country is under attack, and a lot of sentiment. Let's go get the Japanese. Which we can talk more about strategy.
But good. I think that does a great job in setting up the strategic setting for what was coming, the state of the Army, and we'll get more into that. Significant year of 1942.
Stay tuned
in the next episode. But before we close, it's time for our segment called Whoa Trivia. So is there a piece of Army trivia about these interwar years or mobilization that you want to share?
What does the phrase Ohio mean?
Yeah, I was going to say the phrase Ohio.
That state down south has a native of Michigan.
Other than it being a Japanese word for, I think, a greeting, but I don't know. So how does that apply here, Ohio?
Well, in the summer of 1941, before Congress renewed the Draft Act in the service of all those conscriptees, the word Ohio popped up in a lot of barracks, scrawled kind of like Kilroy.
Right.
Popped up in a lot of barracks, Ohio. And when asked what that meant, the serviceman responded, "I'm over the hill in October."
Over the hill in October. What does that mean, over the hill?
That means once the Draft Act expires, I'm out of here.
Oh, okay. So they're all planning just to do their duty and get out.
And get out.
Right.
Yes, my duty will be served. But unfortunately for them, the Congress said you have to, by one vote, said you have to stick around for a little bit longer. And then, of course, came Pearl Harbor. And everybody had to stick around regardless.
Thank you for that. And thank you, Dr. Hogan, for all of your insights today about the state of the Army in the years leading up to World War II. And if anyone wants to learn more about the events leading up to World War II or learn more about Army history in general, I encourage you to explore our website at history.army.mil, M-I-L. And if you want to experience Army history every day, then visit us on social media, on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram. And, we have a great series of books about World War II. Our publications that are all available as free PDF downloads online, or you can purchase hard copies if you would like. We have pamphlets and our Green Books, our Green Book series, which is an amazing series about World War II. So make sure you check all that out on our website. Thank you, everyone, for joining us today on the United States Army History and Heritage Podcast. For the Center of Military History, I'm Lee Reynolds. And until next time, we're history.
The views expressed in this podcast reflect those of the speakers and do not necessarily reflect the views, policies, or opinions of the U.S. Army or Department of Defense. For more information about the Army's proud history and heritage, go to history.army.mil.